Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone, Chapter 1. The Boy Who Lived. Mr. and Mrs. Dursley of number 4 Private Drive were proud to say that they were perfectly normal. Thank you very much. They were the last people you would expect to be involved in anything strange or mysterious because they just didn't hold with such nonsense. Mr. Dudley was the director of a firm called Groenings, which made drills. He was a big, beefy man with hardly any neck, although he did have a very large mustache. Mrs. Dudley was thin and blonde and had nearly twice the usual amount of neck, which came in very useful as she spent so much of her time craning over garden fences, spying on the neighbors. The Dudley had a small son called Dudley, and in their opinion, there was no finer boy anywhere. The Dudley had everything they wanted, but they also had a secret, and their greatest fear was that somebody would discover it. They didn't think they could bear it if anyone found out about the Potters. Mrs. Potter was Mrs. Dursley's sister, but they hadn't met for several years. In fact, Mrs. Dursley pretended she didn't have a sister because her sister had a good for nothing husband, whereas undudlish as it was possible to be. The Dudsleys shuddered to think that the neighbors will say if the Potters arrived in the street. The Dudley knew that Potters had a small son too, but they had never even seen him. This boy was another good reason for keeping the Potters away. They didn't want Dudley mixing with a child like that. When Mr. and Mrs. Dudley woke up on the dull, grey Tuesday, our story starts. There was nothing about the cloudy sky outside to suggest that strange and mysterious things would be happening all over the country. Mr. Dudley hammered as he picked out his most boring tie for it, and Miss Dudley gossiped away happily as she wrestled a screaming Dudley into his high chair. One of them noticed a large, turning owl flutter past the window. At 8:30, Mr. Dudley picked up his briefcase, pecked Miss Dudley on the chair, and tried to kiss Dudley goodbye, but missed. Because Dudley was now having tantrum and throwing his cereal at the walls, little Tyke chattled Mr. Dudley as he left the house. He got into his car and backed out of number 4's drive. It was on the corner of the street that he noticed the first sign of something peculiar. A cat reading a map. For a second, Mr. Dudley didn't realize what he had seen. Then he jerked his head around to look again. There was a tabby cat standing on the corner of Private Drive, but there wasn't a map in sight. What could he have been thinking of? It must have been a trick of the light. Mr. Dudley blinked and stared at the cat. It stared back. As Mr. Dudley drove around the corner and up the road, he watched the cat in his mirror. It was now reading the sign that said Private Drive. No, looking at the sign, cats couldn't read maps or signs. Mr. Dudley gave himself a little shake and put the cat out of his mind. As he drove toward town, he thought of nothing except a large order of drills he was hoping to get that day. But at the edge of town, drills were driven out of his mind by something else. As he sat in the usual morning traffic jam, he couldn't help noticing that there seemed to be a lot of strangely dressed people about. People in cloaks, Mr. Dudley couldn't bear people who dressed in funny clothes. The get-ups you saw on young people. He supposed this was some stupid new fashion. He drummed his fingers on the steering wheel and his eyes fell on a huddle of these weirdos standing quite close by. They were whispering excitedly together. Mr. Dudley was enraged to see that a couple of them weren't young at all. Why, that man had to be older than he was, and wearing an emerald green cloak, the nerve of him, but then it struck Mr. Dudley that it was probably some silly stunt. These people were obviously collecting for something. Yes, that would be it. The traffic moved on, and a few minutes later Mr. Dudley arrived in the Gronin's parking lot, his mind on his drills. Mr. Dudley always sat with his back to the window in his office on the ninth floor. If he hadn't, he might have found it harder to concentrate on drills that morning. He didn't see the owls swooping past in broad daylight, though people down in the street did. They pointed and gazed open-mouthed as all after all sped overhead. Most of them had never seen an owl even at night time. Mr. Dudley, however, had a perfectly normal, owl-free morning. He yelled at 5 different people. He made several important telephone calls and shouted a bit more. He was in a very good mood until lunchtime, when he thought he would stretch his legs and walk across the road to buy himself a bun from the bakery. He had forgotten all about the people in cloaks until he passed a group of them next to the baker's. He eyed them angrily as he passed. He didn't know why, but they made him uneasy. This bunch were whispering excitedly too, and he couldn't see a single collecting thing. It was on his way back past them, clutching a large doughnut in a bag, that he caught a few words of what they were saying. The Porters, that's right, that's what I heard, yes, their son Harry. Mr. Dudley stopped dead. Fear flooded him. He looked back at the whisperers as if he wanted to say something to them, but thought better of it. He dashed back across the road, hurried up to his office, snapped at his secretary not to disturb him, seized his telephone, and had almost finished dialing his home number when he changed his mind. He put the receiver back down and stroked his mustache, thinking, no, he was being stupid. Porter wasn't such an unusual name. He was sure there were lots of people called Porter who had a son called Harry. Come to think of it, he wasn't even sure his nephew was called Harry. He had even seen the boy. He might have been Harvey or Harold. There was no point in worrying Miss Dudley. She always got upset at any mention of her sister. He didn't blame her if he had had a sister like that, but all the same, those people in cloaks. He found it a lot harder to concentrate on drills that afternoon, and when he left the building at 5 o'clock, he was still so worried that he walked straight into someone just outside the door. Sorry, he grunted, as the tiny old man stumbled and also fell. It was a few seconds before Mr. Dudley realized that the man was wearing a violet cloak. He didn't seem at all upset at being almost knocked to the ground. On the contrary, his face split into a wild smile, and he said in a quaky voice what made passers-by stare. Don't be sorry, my dear sir, for nothing could upset me today. Rejoice, for you know who has gone at last. Even muggles like yourself should be celebrating. this happy, happy day. And the old man hugged Mr. Dursley around the middle and walked off. Mr. Dursley stood rooted to the spot. He had been hugged by a complete stranger. He also thought he had been called a muggle. Whatever that was, he was rattled. He hurried to his car and set off for home, hoping he was imagining things which he had never hoped before because he didn't approve of imagination. As he pulled into the driveway of number 4, the first thing he saw, and it didn't improve his mood, was the tabby cat he had spotted that morning. It was now sitting on his garden wall. He was sure it was the same one. It had the same markings around his eyes. "Shoo," said Mr. Dudley loudly. The cat didn't move. It just gave him a stern look. Was the normal cat behavior? Mr. Dudley wondered, trying to pull himself together. He let himself into the house. He was still determined not to mention anything to his wife. Miss Dudley had had a nice, normal day. She told him over dinner all about Miss Next Door's problems with her daughter and how Dudley had learned a new word once. Mr. Dudley tried to act normally. When Dudley had been put to bed, he went into the living room in time to catch the last report on the evening news. And finally, bird watchers everywhere had reported that the nation's owls have been behaving very unusually today. Although owls normally hunt at night and are hardly ever seen in daylight, there have been hundreds of sightings of these birds flying in every direction since sunrise. Experts are unable to explain why the owls have suddenly changed their sleeping pattern. The newscaster allowed himself a grin. Most mysterious. And now over to Jim McGruffin. What the weather? Going to be any more showers of owls tonight, Jim? Well, Ted, said the weatherman, I don't know about that, but it's not only the owls that have been acting oddly today. Viewers as far as apart as Kent, Yorkshire and Dundee have been phoning in to tell me that instead of the rain I promised yesterday, they have had a downpour of shooting stars. Perhaps people have been celebrating bonfire night early. It's not until next week, folks, but I can promise a wet night tonight. Mr. Dursley sat frozen in his armchair, shooting stars all over Britain, owls flying by daylight, mysterious people in cloaks all over the place, and a whisper about the porters. Mrs. Dursley came into the living room carrying 2 cups of tea. It was no good. He had to say something to her. He cleared his throat nervously. Petunia dear, you haven't heard from your sister lately, have you? As he had expected, Miss Dursley looked shocked and angry. After all, they normally pretended she didn't have a sister. No, she said sharply. Why? Funny stuff on the news. Mr. Dudley mumbled. Owls, shooting stars, and there were a lot of funny-looking people in town today. So, snapped Miss Dursley. Well, I just thought maybe it was something to do with you know her crowd. Miss Dursley sipped her tea through pursed lips. Mr. Dursley wondered whether he dared tell her he had the name Potter. He decided he didn't dare. Instead, he said, as casually as he could, their son, he'll be about Dudley's age now, wouldn't he? I suppose so, said Miss Dursley stiffly. What's his name again? Howard, isn't it? Harry. Nasty. Common name, if you ask me. Oh yes, said Mr. Dursley, his heart sinking horribly. Yes, I quite agree. He didn't say another word on the subject as they went upstairs to bed. While Miss Dursley was in the bathroom, Mr. Dursley crept to the bedroom window and peered down into the front garden. The cat was still there. It was staring down Private Drive as though it were waiting for something. Was he imagining things? Could all this have anything to do with the Porters? If it did, if it got out that they were related to a pair of, well, he didn't think he could bear it. The Dursleys got into bed. Miss Dursley fell asleep quickly, but Mr. Dursley lay awake, turning it all over in his mind. His last comforting thought before he fell asleep was that when if the Potters were involved, there was no reason for them to come near him and Miss Dursley. The Potters knew very well that he and Petunia thought about them and their kind. He couldn't see how he and Petunia could get mixed up in anything that might be going on. He yawned and turned over. It couldn't affect them. How very wrong he was. Mr. Dursley might have been drifting into an uneasy sleep, but the cat on the wall outside was showing no sign of sleepiness. It was sitting as still as a statue, its eyes fixed unblinkably on the far corner of the private drive. It didn't so much as quivered and the car door slammed on the next street, nor when two owls swept overhead. In fact, it was nearly midnight before the cat moved at all. A man appeared on the corner the cat had been watching, appeared so suddenly and silently you'd have thought he just popped out of the ground. The cat's tail switched and its eyes narrowed. Nothing like this man had ever seen on Private Drive. He was tall, thin, and very old, judging by the silver of his hair and beard, which were both long enough to tuck into his belt. He was wearing long robes, a purple cloak that swept the ground, and a high-heeled, buckled boots. His blue eyes were light, bright, and sparkling behind half-moon spectacles, and his nose was very long and crooked, as though it had been broken at least twice. The man's name was Albus Dumbledore. Albus Dumbledore didn't seem to realize that he had just arrived in a street where everything from his name to his boots was unwelcome. He was busy rummaging in his cloak, looking for something, but he did not seem to realize he was being watched, because he looked up suddenly at the cat, which was still staring at him from the other end of the street. For some reason, the sight of the cat seemed to amuse him. He chuckled and muttered, "I should have known." He found what he was looking for in his inside pocket. It seemed to be a silver cigarette lighter. He flicked it open, held it up in the air, and clicked it. The nearest street lamp went out with a little pop. He clicked it again. The next lamp flickered into darkness. 12 times he clicked the put-outer until the only lights left on the whole street were two tiny pink prints in the distance, which were the eyes of the cat watching him. If anyone looked out of your window now, even beady-eyed Miss Dursley, they wouldn't be able to see anything that was happening down on the pavement. Dumbledore slipped the put-outer back into his cloak and set off down the street toward number 4, where he sat down.